Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to Navigating Startup Law with Becki DeGraw. My name is Colin Mahan, and I'm a program manager at the Nasdaq Entrepreneurial Center. And for those of you who may not know, the Nasdaq Center is a nonprofit dedicated to enabling entrepreneurs from all over the world to realize their maximum potentials and grow. As you may have just seen in the chat, the Nasdaq Center, along with our partner Mentor Cloud, launched a free mentor matching platform for entrepreneurs called Mentor Makers. You can create your own advisory board to guide and inspire you with in-the-moment mentorship from topic experts and professionals dedicated to providing exceptional mentorship for entrepreneurs across all races, industries, and geographies. So find or become a mentor today by using the link in the chat. Mentorship matters to all entrepreneurs. Their success is dependent on it. Quick housekeeping item, we're going to open up for live Q&A at the end of the event, so please submit your questions for Becki in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation. Again, none of what we could would be possible without all the amazing support from our sponsors, including Nasdaq, Lehigh University, Bank of the West, KPMG, Wilson Sonsini, Woodruff Sawyer, BPM, and NZTE. We're humbled by their contributions. Before we get started, during these still somewhat unique times, we're curious on how sentiment is among the entrepreneurs we work with. So we're going to start by taking a quick poll to let us know how you're doing. First question, how are you feeling? We have been taking this since the beginning of 2020. So hopefully the optimism is on the rise, but we do understand that still survival mode and some anxiousness are still out there. Second question, what's keeping you up at night? That poll helps us understand the responsive programming like this one that you all requested that we should be hosting in the coming month. So appreciate you guys voting really quickly, but I don't want to waste too much time. So I'm going to wait for a couple more to come in and then I'll share these results with you all. All righty. Looks like we're almost halfway there. All right, I'm going to share these results. Well, I was true on optimism being at the top, but totally understand some of you are just surviving and some of you are anxious. So hopefully the discussion today and the ones we'll be hosting in the next month will help increase that optimism layer. And what's keeping you up is finance. Well, good news for all of you. The talk today and many that we're going to be hosting in the future will help you with that. So without any further delay, please join me in giving a warm welcome in the chat to our special guest, Becki DeGraw. She's a corporate partner at Wilson Sonsini. Becki, welcome. So happy to have you talk about this very needed topic.
Hi, everyone. Good to see you. Let me just pull up the slides here and we'll get started. All right, that look good to everyone? Hopefully so.
Looks great.
Wonderful. All right, I will jump right in, assuming, there we go. Okay, so we're going to go through just a couple of things today. As Colin mentioned, it's all going to be related to financing stuff. So I'll first do just a quick intro to Wilson Sonsini. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we'll talk a little bit about some things to think about as you're getting ready for your first round of financing. Once that term sheet comes in, things to consider when you're negotiating it. And then after the money is in the bank and you have the priced round under your belt, what are some next steps to think about at that point as well? So I'm a corporate partner at Wilson Sonsini. I practice normally out of our SOMA office. And I work with companies at all stages, from their very, very earliest stages of I've got an idea, how do I start a company, all the way up until, a liquidity event as well. I also work really closely with investors. So probably about half my time is representing companies and half my time is representing investors. So I really get to see the full market of what's out there. Just a little bit about Wilson Sonsini, if you're not familiar with us. We've been around for about 60 years, and we really started as a firm saying, there's not a firm out there that is dedicated to working with startups and following them through their life cycle. And that's really how we got started and how we grew to where we are today of, more than 800 attorneys worldwide. And a really good example of this is Google. We incorporated Google. We worked with them throughout their life cycle of helping them in their day-to-day, corporate matters. Through all their financing transactions, we took them public, represent them as a public company, and now probably every practice area at the firm works on something Google related. Personally, I do the investment work for Google, so it's a good example of how we can work with the very earliest of companies and the largest of companies. And there's also a lot of other resources that are available to folks. We do things like this with partners where we do various webinars or founder universities or college for clients series. All of that is kind of in the education side of things to get you resources that you need as entrepreneurs as you're going through this process. We also, because we are involved in so many of these transactions, have a lot of data on hand and are able to put together various reports and compile that so that it is hopefully helpful. One of those is the Entrepreneurs Report, and all of this stuff is available on our website. We actually just launched a new website just a couple weeks ago for the emerging companies practice. And there's all sorts of resources on there, term sheet generators, data, forms. So if you haven't taken a look at it, go check it out. It can be helpful as you're navigating these early stages. All right, so let's get into the heart of it. And this is really going to talk about some of the things to think about as we are getting ready for that first round of fundraising. Typically what has happened up until that point? You've formed the company, you've got your founder stock issued, you're getting ready probably to commercialize, to enter into, client, customer contracts. You're probably likely not quite there yet in your first round of funding. If you are, great, you're a step ahead. In terms of, the amount of money that you're looking for, when we're talking about a priced round, generally, it is probably 2.5 to 10 million ish for those first rounds. A lot of times before you get to that first, preferred equity priced round, you may have done some friends and family or angel investing, at lower amounts to bridge you to get to that point, or maybe you bootstrapped. One of the things to think about is, what investors are the right fit for you and your company. At the end of the day, you really want to try to find somebody who's going to be a value add to you. They're likely going to want a seat on the board. What networking can they help you with? How can they help you grow, either from an operational standpoint or fundraising standpoint or whatever it is that you're looking for. But ideally, they have industry expertise that they can help you with. So as you're getting ready to have those investor discussions, one of the first things is just get familiar with the lingo. What are some of the things that they're gonna, be talking about? You're gonna hear pre-money valuation and post-money valuations and liquidation preferences, and just to also understand the process, of kind of how does this happen? You have conversations with, a one-off individual investor, and then they have to go back to their committee, and then they produce a term sheet. What's the time period with respect to getting that term sheet and actually closing the deal? All of those things is just helpful information so that when you go into the process, you have a better understanding of what that is. Chatting with your legal counsel on that, can certainly help you understand that, get the lingo down so that you can be more informed and be able to negotiate, hopefully from a better position. I get this question a lot in terms of, okay, well, how can I best position myself to get the highest valuation? Obviously, the business model itself is going to be important. The more traction that you can already show, the more metrics, great. However, I know at these, very early stages, a lot of times you don't have that. And what investors are looking at largely is, yes, they got to buy into the business model, but they're also looking at the team, right? So emphasizing, what background the team members have and what they bring to the table and why they're able to solve this unique problem. But at the end of the day, the number one thing that I think influences and maximizes the valuation in the best terms that you can get is competition. So, a suggestion there is, and you don't have a ton of control over it, but to the extent that you do, try to set up those meetings in quick succession so that you are talking to investors all around the same period of time, generating that interest around the same period of time. The way that you can get that valuation to go up in the quickest way is you can say to investor A, hey, I've got a term sheet from investor B, and investor C, if you're interested, the clock is ticking, I've already got a term sheet on the table. I need to respond to them. That's the way that, I've seen, valuations climb quickly and founders be able to have the best leverage in those situations. And, it's a great position to be in too, because then you can, really decide which investor, is the right fit for you, as opposed to like, well, this is the only one on the table. This is the one that I have to take. Other things that you can do to put yourself, in a position to where that financing transaction can go really smoothly is, build a data room in advance. Your lawyers can provide you with a due diligence request list that'll set forth all of the types of things that, the investors council is going to ask for. You can get your data room all organized, get all the documents in there. And one of the things that'll do is probably identify areas where there may be some cleanup that needs to happen. If you're loading documents into that data room and half of them are unsigned, that's a good sign to say, okay, maybe we should track these down and get those signed before the term sheet comes in, so that doesn't hold up the process. Make sure that your team is properly equitized. What does that mean? In terms of your founder shares, make sure that you've got the right allocation. Make sure that if you've got verbal agreements with folks to issue equity, that you actually get that equity issued prior to the term sheet coming in. We see this often where it's like, oh, well, we have this verbal agreement. We'll get it done. We just haven't gotten around to it yet. And then, you start the conversations with investors. And once you start the conversations with investors, sometimes it can snowball really quickly. And if, a term sheet comes across that says, hey, I want to invest in your company, and we're going to put a $20 million valuation on the company. As soon as that term sheet comes across with that valuation on it, you can no longer issue equity to, your employees, consultants, advisors at a cheap price. And in fact, at that point, you're kind of blacked out until after the financing in order to issue that equity. So, really make sure that is all cleaned up before that comes in, so that you can, get the equity in hands of folks at hopefully a cheaper valuation. So it's more of an incentive to those folks. Your pitch deck. Right, to investors, spend some time on it. This is really important. It's going to be one of the first things that catches their eyes. You don't want a 100-page pitch deck. They're not going to go through that. You want it to be clear, concise, cover the things that the investors are going to ask about. I always also suggest, some sort of really short executive summary or bullets that you can include in an email. That's likely going to be the thing that catches their interest to even get them to open the deck. So keep that in mind as well. I think all of these things, that we just talked about, are really putting yourself in a position of strength to be able to raise from, and that's going to be important when it comes to the negotiations and the leverage once you get to that term sheet stage. So valuation. This is certainly like the near and dear to all of your hearts, and kind of the number one issue, right, when you're negotiating a priced round is, well, what's the valuation going to be? One thing to just pause on here is just to understand the difference between pre-money evaluation and post-money evaluation. Pre-money evaluation means that prior to any new money coming into the company, the financing round itself, what's the valuation of the company? To get to the post-money valuation, you would take your pre-money and then you would add in the new money that you're raising in the financing transaction. That's your post-money valuation. So all that sounds like, okay, that's simple. I can understand that. Just be careful when you see the term sheets come across. Some are based on pre-money, some are based on post-money. So when you are comparing term sheets, just make sure you're doing whatever conversion is necessary. So you're comparing apples to apples. The other thing I would note is what is included in the pre-money. Is to understand that, because that can actually move the needle by quite a bit. And the two things that are most common that you're going to see there is investors will typically ask for an option pool increase in connection with the financing round. Basically, what they want is they want this available pool, because at the end of the day, they're giving you money, and you're probably going to use a lot of that money to go out and hire a bunch of folks. And you're going to use that money to hire folks, but you're also going to give them some equity. So investors, when they're putting money in the company, they want a certain percentage of the company. And 1 month later, they don't want the company to say, oh, well, I have to increase my option pool, which means dilution to you, investor. So they kind of preload this and say there's going to be this available pool that you can use on a going forward basis. Usually, almost always, that option pool increase is on a pre-money basis. And what that means is that you, as the common holders of the company, are going to take 100% of that dilution. Investors will come in after that increase has already happened so that none of the dilution hits them. And that essentially decreases your pre-money valuation. The other thing that often gets baked in is like your convertible notes or safes, if you have any of those outstanding. If you've done a friends and family round or angel round prior to getting to your preferred stock priced round, those need to convert. And how do those get handled? Again, almost always those are part of the pre-money valuation, which again means if the term sheet says it's a 20 million pre-money valuation, but it has to include a 10% option plan and all of your convertibles are counted in the pre-money, that pre-money valuation is actually less than 20 million. It's 20 million minus those two things. Valuation is influenced by market conditions. Right now, it is a very company and friendly market. Valuations are quite high in terms of what we have seen over really the last decade, and competition, as I already mentioned, is certainly going to influence the valuation that you ultimately end up with. So how do you figure out what is the right valuation? It's hard as a private company. It's not like you can go online and start researching like you can public companies. There are some ways that you can look at valuations of similar companies and market conditions. The entrepreneurs report that I mentioned earlier. There's a number of websites, PitchBook, and various others, that you can do at least some research. Some private companies, keep it very tight under wraps in terms of when they raise. You may not even know. Some, there are, big press releases about. So if there is information out there, just understanding what other companies have got and having a little bit of feel for the market can at least help give you a sense of where the market is at. So before we get into what the terms of a preferred stock financing are, I thought I might take just a quick step back and talk about the different types of equity. Common stock, that's what founders, service providers are going to hold, your employees, your consultants, your advisors. And common stock, all it is you can think of it in terms of there's not any special rights attached to it. There's not any preference attached to it. When we set the valuation of common stock, it will be a fraction of what your preferred stock price will be. And typically, in these very early stages, hopefully, you were able to issue, your equity to yourselves at the very beginning of the company, when you can say, hey, the company's not really worth anything. We're just starting it. You can get really, cheap equity in your hands. So then what is a preferred stock? So preferred stock simply means the number one feature of it is that it has a liquidation preference. And that means on a change of control transaction, like if you're selling the company, the preferred stock is going to get paid first prior to the common stock getting paid anything. The preferred stock will also have a number of other kind of special rights associated with it. We'll talk about a few of those once we, get into the term sheet section coming up. But just think of it, there's kind of this whole bundle of rights that the preferred stock gets. And the reason that we want to sell preferred stock to investors and not common stock is because we want to be able to have that differentiation between the two different classes of stock to be able to kind of reserve the common stock so that we can issue that to employees. And the reason for that is if we have this preferred stock and it has this liquidation preference such that it gets paid first, and that has all these other special rights attached to it, we can discount the common stock and say, well, the common stock should only be a fraction of what that preferred stock is because it doesn't have all those bells and whistles. And by doing that, we can keep the price per share of the common stock much lower. And that can then be used as compensation to employees and other service providers. If you're selling your preferred stock at a $20 million valuation, you don't want to have to turn around and sell that stock to your employees at a $20 million valuation. They're going to be like, whoa, that's not a good deal for me. That's not really great from a compensation standpoint. So that's really why we have the two different classes. The other thing I'll note kind of about timing on these transactions, right? It's going to take a little bit of time once you, going to go through what we just talked about of, getting ready for it, identifying the right investors, having those conversations. Once the term sheet comes across, then you've got to actually negotiate all the transaction documents and get them in place. That term sheet, may be anywhere from a half a page long to 10 pages long, but that term sheet is really only a fraction, right? That's just summarizing the material terms of what the actual documents are going to be. There's usually 5 main financing documents, about 20 pages each. There's probably another 10 or so ancillary documents that go along with these financings and consents and opinions and other things. I would say from the time that you sign the term sheet, plan for about 3 to 4 weeks to actually get to closing, i.e. money in the bank. And that can vary depending on, usually 3 weeks is going to be kind of at the really short end. It can be longer if there's, cleanup items that need to happen or investors are taking a little bit longer to do diligence, those types of things. There is a Series Seed preferred stock. And I'll note this in that there used to be really a lighter version of the Series A called the Series Seed. And what the idea was behind it is, if you're raising, maybe 1 million or 2 million, kind of at the lower end of the range, and we really just want to put the documents in place as quickly as we can. We want to try to do it a little bit cheaper. We want to try to punt some of the rights until later. This was a way to do that. And it was essentially a light version of the Series A, meaning we're not going to include all of the bells and whistles, all of the rights. Instead, we would include a provision that says, okay, here's, the really important stuff, like your liquidation preference and your pro rata rights, but a lot of the other rights, we're going to punt until the next round. And when you give those rights to the next round investors, these Series Seed investors will also get them. I will say two caveats about this. One, we just don't see it that much anymore. It was fairly popular for a little period of time. And then investors are saying, you know what, I don't want this light version. I want the full bells and whistles. We're going to get them anyways. When you do your next round, you might as well just do it now. And from a cost perspective, it may be cheaper today to do this because there are less documents to negotiate. It is, a little bit quicker to put in place. It doesn't really save you the money, it just defers it. Because at the next round, you're going to have to go through the whole process. And because the documents generally aren't set up well to transition into the full set of Series A documents, it does require a little bit of a rewrite at the next round. All of those reasons have kind of led to, well, let's just do the full set of documents at the beginning most of the time. However, if you have the leverage and you want to try to push it out, maybe this is an avenue to explore. Another way that companies raise money is through bank debt. At these very, very early stages, like before you have like your institutional investors, before you have a priced round, before you have customer contracts, revenue coming in, it'll often require a personal guarantee from the founders in order to get it. There's usually financial covenants and metrics that you have to hit, which may not be realistic from a balance sheet perspective for most startups. There are facilities that can be secured by cash flows and accounts receivable, also may not be realistic if you don't have those things. So the takeaway here is at the very earliest stages, bank debt's not usually a real option for startups. Safes in convertible notes, we see this all the time. This is usually the first form of fundraising that you have come in. Usually, it's going to be for a little bit smaller dollar amounts, friends, family, angels. The benefit is they're super easy to do. They're a whole lot less paper, so a lot less to negotiate. You don't have to set the valuation today like you do on a priced round. They almost have no governance rights or consent rights, or they're very, very limited in that. There's a whole bunch of pros and cons and differences between the safes and convertible notes, probably enough for a whole webinar. So I won't go into that. Just know that there are some differences, and understand them, chat with your legal counsel to see which one may be the better route for you, and go from there. All right, term sheet. Let's talk about some of the key terms that you're going to see, and things to focus on the most when you're negotiating one of these preferred stock term sheets. So valuation, we already talked about that. And included in the valuation is that option pool increase that I mentioned. I'll say it again, if you have any convertible notes or safes, that's also going to be a part of that valuation discussion. It's kind of hard to conceptualize all of it. Like, okay, yeah, and in theory, I get it. My pre-money valuation is going to be reduced. The dilution is going to happen all to existing stockholders prior to the investors coming in. But what does that really mean? Like if I own, 30% of the company today as a founder, what does that mean after this whole round gets done? The safes convert, the option pool is increased, and the new money comes in. Well, there's a really easy way you can see that, and that's by a pro forma cap table. Your legal counsel is going to have to prepare that in connection with the financing round anyway. I would encourage you to ask them to do it at the term sheet stage so that you can really see, okay, I own 30% of the company today. After all of this gets taken into account, I'm going to hold 20% of the company, or whatever the numbers are. But that's the best way to visualize it, is to model it out in that pro forma cap table. All right, so in a couple of slides, and I think you're all going to get to these distributed afterwards, so you'll be able to go through them in more detail. We're going to kind of go a little quickly here, so we can at least get a quick overview of everything. So when you see it, but there's a chart that goes through and has each of these provisions and talks about kind of what's the most common company favorable, what's the most common investor favorable, and what's some maybe compromise positions in between. So you'll have that. So liquidation preference, what is that? We talked about that a little bit earlier. It's the preferred stock's right to get paid first prior to any common stock. In a term sheet, you'll typically see that described as like a one-time liquidation preference. And that means if investors paid $1 per share, they get $1 per share is what their liquidation preference is. It can also be participating or non-participating. Participating means after that $1 per share, whatever the original issue price is, they also get to participate on a per share basis on whatever gets paid out to the common stock. That is very, very investor favorable. And if you see anything other than a one-time non-participating liquidation preference for your first round of funding, I would say it's very aggressive. Your first round of funding almost always is in that one-time non-participating, and that is really the most company favorable. Dividends. So almost never do startups pay dividends. The reason this provision is there to begin with is really just to circumvent any kind of workaround with respect to the liquidation preference. So the way that we word dividends is if and when they're declared by the board, then the preferred would get paid first. You don't really have to, I would say this is not one to focus on. It's more, it's going to be in every deal, every term sheet, but it's not really a huge point of negotiation. Conversion features. So your preferred stock always has the ability to convert into common stock. Really, the only time that that's going to happen is on an IPO of the company or in connection with the sale of the company. And if in connection with the sale of the company, the preferred stock would get paid more on a per share basis as being a common stock, it will convert. And that's how, it not just gets its one-time return back, but actually gets to participate in the upside. Anti-dilution protection. What this means is that if you are selling your preferred stock at $1 per share today, and you go and you do your next preferred stock funding round and it comes in at 90 cents per share, something less, right, than what the investors paid, and it's a down round, then the investors today would get some protection over that. And essentially the way that protection works is we adjust what the conversion ratio is when the preferred converts to common. It gets really complicated. Hopefully you never have to deal with down round situations. If you do, definitely get your legal counsel involved, but at least be aware that protection is out there for the preferred stock, so that if there is any issuances that are at less than what they're paying, expect there to be an adjustment or you'll need to ask them for a waiver. Preemptive rights are really just pro rata rights. This is one that's really important to investors. They want to know that when the next round comes, that they have an opportunity to continue to maintain their percentage ownership in the company. We'll often try to have these pro rata rights limited to just folks that are considered major investors. And usually that's set by including a threshold number of shares that folks need to hold. And the idea behind that is, all the really, really little folks, we don't necessarily want to have to go out from an admin perspective and, see if they want to participate and allow them to do so. So it's usually just limited to the bigger investors. Founder vesting. This will be something that is near and dear to your hearts because it's going to impact you personally. Right now, you all own shares in the company. You probably have vesting on those shares. Investors want to know that you are going to be, locked up with the company. It's the golden handcuffs, right? At the end of the day, and as I mentioned earlier, particularly at these really early stages, a lot of what they're investing in is the company, right? The founders, and they want to know that you're going to stay there. So they're going to want to make sure that there's enough vesting left on your shares to keep you motivated to stick around. Some of the other governance terms that are going to come up in preferred stock financing is board composition. So if you're doing, a priced round, highly likely that your lead investor is going to want a board seat. And that's normal to give that up. The key is just making sure at this really early stage that you don't give up control of the board. A typical composition after your first priced round would be maybe 2 common seats and 1 preferred seat, or even 3 common seats and 1 preferred seat, depending on how many co-founders you have. But at the end of the day, the idea is that the common seats on a majority basis of the board still control those decisions. And one of the things to really understand is once you add that director to your board, there's a lot of things that the board has to approve in order for them to go through, right? So any equity issuance, any option grant, the next financing, the board also controls hiring and firing of the CEO. So obviously who controls that is very important. I, would always try to encourage folks that, it should be commensurate with the amount of money that the investors are bringing in, right? So at the early stages, if, an investor is writing a $3 million check or $5 million check even, and that probably doesn't justify giving up control of the company yet. It should probably take around maybe 2 rounds or even more before the common loses that control of the board. And eventually the common usually does lose control of the board. Hopefully you get to a point where it's at least balanced, but those are some things to think about. Voting rights. This is the other way where preferred stock can have some control mechanisms, right? It doesn't have to always be at the board level. There are some things that have to go to the stockholder level. And those we typically call protective provisions. And what that means is there's going to be a list of things that show up in the term sheet where it says, in order for you to take these actions, in addition to getting the board approval, you have to come and you have to get a majority of the preferred stock to approve these items. So your common stock shares no longer count for that vote. You literally have to go to just the investors to get approval on those types of things. Some of the things that fall into that category, are going to be like a future financing, a change of control transaction, maybe increasing the size of the board, maybe incurring debt in excess of a certain amount, or increasing your option plan. Those are some of the more typical ones that fall into that category where you'd have to get the preferred stockholder vote as well. And then there are going to be some liquidity constraints. So as your shares probably already have a company right of first refusal over your shares, if you're going to transfer or sell your shares, the company has kind of the first bite at the apple. The investors want the second bite. So if the company doesn't exercise its ROFR, the investors will ask for a ROFR over a sale of your shares. They also ask for co-sale rights, so that if you are selling to some third party, they may say, well, I don't want to buy those shares from you. No, that's a good deal. I want to be included in that too. So I want to sell alongside you. That's kind of what we call co-sale or tag-along rights. And those usually only apply to common stockholders. So certainly the founders will be subject to that. And then usually any other 1% or greater common stockholder also gets subject to those things. And the drag along, that really just says in connection with a sale of the company, after it hits certain approvals, maybe it's a majority of preferred and a majority of common stock, then all the other stockholders have to vote in favor of that transaction. So those are some of the terms that you're going to see in the term sheet. These next ones here, registration rights, we don't worry about those so much in these early stages. Information rights, that's really just giving investors quarterly and annual financial statements. Certainly probably a more formal process than what you're going through right now. Usually after a preferred round, if you haven't already, this is the time, to get company accountants involved and to be able to prepare those on a regular basis so that you are providing those, that they're GAAP compliant, et cetera. Exclusivity, your term sheet is going to have an exclusivity provision in it, which basically says, hey, once you sign this with the investor, you can't keep shopping around. You can't continue conversations with other investors. So once you sign that term sheet, make sure that this is the one that you want to go with. The period of time, usually 30 to 45 days is pretty average, and that's about how long it'll take, right, to get the financing done. Expenses. As you're going to have to pay for your counsel fees, but the thing that some founders don't realize is that in these preferred stock financings, it's absolutely customary for the company to pay for the investors' legal fees as well. So part of the term sheet will usually negotiate a fee cap on what the company will pick up for the investor counsel. You can see that anywhere from 25 to 50K. 35, 40 is most common and what you'll see most often in the first round. As you raise further rounds, the dollars get bigger, those expenses also get bigger, so be prepared for that as well. And then confidentiality, investors are going to say, hey, you can't talk to other folks about these terms, right? Again, it's kind of the whole, we're negotiating, I don't want you using these terms to try to get a better deal elsewhere. This is that handy chart that I mentioned. I'm not going to go through this. You guys can take a look at it. We covered some of it, but hopefully that's useful. Investor relations, the one thing I'll say here is choose your investors wisely. I often compare it to a marriage, right? When you decide which investor you're going to take, particularly those that are going to have a board seat, right? You cannot unilaterally get rid of that board seat. In order for that board seat to go away, almost always it's going to be that the investor has to voluntarily agree to it. So unlike a marriage where you can say, hey, this isn't working out, I want a divorce, it's actually much harder to get out of a investor relationship that has a director seat. So make sure that when you are picking your investors, it's not just, hey, this is the biggest check or the biggest valuation, but understand who's going to be sitting on that board. You're going to be working with them hand in hand for a long period of time, likely, and make sure that you can work with this person, that you like them, that they're going to be a good value add to you. And then just as, investors are doing diligence on you and reference checks on you, absolutely flip the table. Like you should ask to chat with some of the founders, CEOs of some of their portfolio companies. Do your homework on them as well. And then in terms of, the whole negotiation process, just one tip there is choose your fights wisely. If you go back to the investors and say, I have 25 things that I don't like about your markups, they're probably going to be less receptive than saying, all right, here's the 5 things that I really, really care about that really going to make a difference to me. And that, I really would like to find a way to get to a more reasonable middle ground approach. And there probably are going to be just a few things that really rise to that level anyway. And don't be afraid to ask, hey, why do you really need this? And to have a conversation about it. That also helps kind of weed out, what terms they care most about as well. Okay, so this is the best part. You've closed your round, the money is in the bank. Now what? Now that you have all this money, probably one of the first things you're going to want to do is actually go out and start using that money to hire folks. As we kind of already talked about, you're going to have this available option pool. You're going to start pulling from that as you bring on folks. And one really important thing to note here is before you can issue any option grants under that pool, you need to know what your fair market value is, which means once you get the round closed, one of your first things that you should be thinking about is if you don't already have a cap table management system in place, think about getting that in place. From this point forward, it's going to get more and more complicated in managing your cap table. But coupled with that, most of the cap table management software also offers 409A valuations. Carta and ShareWorks are 2 of the most popular that we see. But at that point, you're also going to want to get a valuation report done. So it's called a 409A valuation report that'll set what the fair market value is so that you can start issuing options to folks. There is some lead time to that, a couple of weeks. So the sooner you get that process started, once you close the round, the sooner you'll be able to start actually issuing equity to employees and service providers. This one, we already talked a lot about this, in terms of, a lot of the decisions have to go through the board and who has the control rights over those and what does a typical board look like, post Series A. We also talked about the stockholder voting rights called the protective provisions. So just remembering and keeping those things in mind, it's going to be a lot more formal going forward after you get those investors involved, right? You're going to have real board meetings. You're going to have board decks that you prepare and present to them. Anytime you need to get a board approval, it's not just you making the decision. You'll need to get the investor director to weigh in as well. And you may have to go to the stockholders to get approval. So just remembering that those extra formalities are now in place. And with that, I think that brings us to the end of the presentation part, and we get to go to the fun part, the Q&A, and hear what some of your questions are, and hopefully get some answers out to you guys. And with that, I'll turn it over to Colin to help facilitate that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Becki. You went through a lot, but it was all very valuable. So yeah, I really appreciate you sharing your insights. And for all of you who have tons more legal questions outside of what we covered today, Wilson Sonsini has a really amazing emerging companies practice website that has a bunch of free resources for all of you out there, which I hope that, boom, Isa just posted in the chat. So check that out. We'll also follow up with it on the follow-up email. So we've got a ton of free pre-submitted questions as well as some that just came in. So you were talking about 409As, and they're a bootstrap startup asked, how do I create an initial valuation pre-capital raise?
Yeah, so that's always like a hard part, right? Is like when you first form the company, it's easy because you can say, I have nothing, I just formed the company, we're just getting started. So the valuation must be super cheap and I can buy and sell stock at 1,000th of a penny per share, 100th of a penny per share, whatever that is, right? And then there's this period of time usually that companies go through where they haven't raised their priced round yet, but they're developing IP. They may be getting some traction. Maybe they even have early customers. Maybe they even have some early revenue coming in. And that's where you're in this gray area. And maybe even have sold, 500,000 worth of safes or convertible notes. What's the value of the company? That's really hard to figure out. You can, the super safe route is you can go through and actually hire, this independent third party, Carta Value, ShareWorks, or there's all sorts of valuation firms out there to do a 409A valuation. And that provides a safe harbor for folks, meaning it essentially can't be challenged. A lot of people say at that early stage, I don't have the money to do that. And they put it off and they do their best, right? And to try to figure out like what the valuation is. Depending on how much you raise and how much traction and everything else that you have going on in the company, you may be more pushing it in maybe you're getting closer to the black as opposed to the gray. Talk to your legal counsel about that before you decide to issue equity, because there are pretty severe tax consequences if you get it wrong. Basically, it can be taxed as compensation, meaning that there's, ordinary income tax that goes along with this equity grant. Nobody wants that because these shares aren't able to even be sold. So you're going to have a tax bill with no liquidity to it. So just caution on that side of thinking about it when you are in that gray area.
Amazing, super helpful. And also we have posted on our YouTube page some webinars around valuation. If whoever asked that question wants to take a look, there's a lot of ways of doing it cheaply from experts, but also consult your counsel because you never know what corners you're gonna get to go through. You mentioned intellectual property. Somebody asked, can you use IP as collateral to get a bank loan for a startup?
You can. You just have to have collateral with value, right? So, and that's always the hard part in the very, very early stages of, okay, well, I wrote some code. What is the bank going to do with that code? Like if you were the bank and you were to actually okay, the company can't pay and I'm going to take the collateral. What do I do with that collateral? Can I sell it and pay off the loan? So certainly the more robust your IP portfolio is, like if you actually have patents or things like that have real value, banks will absolutely look to that. But that usually comes later in the stages of the company.
Amazing. We have another question around experience with BCorps. Are there any special considerations and worthwhile mentions for those while doing this process?
Yeah, so they are fairly rare, is the first thing I would note. Some investors don't like them. So you're probably going to reduce your investor pool of folks who are interested. The primary reason for that is as a B Corp, and this is a true benefit corporation, there's a B certification, which is a different process. But if you are actually going to be a public benefit corporation, which is a different thing than a C corporation, in that, what that says is that the board of directors does not have to maximize stockholder value. It can take into account other things, such as your social mission. And as you can imagine, investors who may be wanting you to maximize stockholder value and not take into account so much your social mission may have some aversion. So that'd be the one thing to caution, is you're probably going to decrease your investor pool.
Awesome. But the good news is there are some funds out there who are environmentally and socially focused on creating value. So but the majority, as you're mentioning, are hoping to focus on shareholder value. This is an interesting one. Can you discuss some of the differences between East Coast and West Coast term sheet conventions?
Yes, it's a true thing. So East Coast tends to be more aggressive, more investor favorable. Here for your traditional venture capital who's based in West Coast, Silicon Valley, there's a norm. There's definitely a market standard. And there's so much competition out here on both sides, right? Like when a company's trying to find investors, there's so many investors, but there's so many companies too. So investors do have a reputation, and it's important. Kind of when I was talking about doing diligence on the investors. If investors tend to get a reputation of being very aggressive, they may not even get to the term sheet stage, right, in these competitive times. So there is a big difference. West Coast is going to be more, generally speaking, going to be more company favorable, more friendly than your East Coast folks.
Great advice and interesting data point. Let's see. Question around a startup CEO who's not paid at market level. Can she or he get paid later in the form of cash/stock?
Yeah, of course. And that's how most startups go, right? I mean, like most startups, before you get your first funding round, the salary is quite low, usually not commensurate with the amount of work, particularly the amount of work it takes to get a startup off the ground, because there's just no dollars in the company to pay, market rate. So that should certainly be one of the topics of conversation. Once you've got money in the bank, of okay, I need to start paying myself kind of more of a market rate. What is that going to be? Let's have a conversation about that investor and make sure that we're on the same page there.
So it's great advice. And yes, usually, the girl, the guy, the dog in the garage doesn't make much money up front. So you got to make sure to pay yourselves, folks, at some point during the journey. Question, what are requirements for investors under SAFEs?
For investors.
So who could founders sign SAFEs with? Does it need to be accredited investors or unaccredited, foreign companies, foreign citizens?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, anytime you're selling anything, whether it's a convertible note or a SAFE or it's preferred stock, everybody really needs to be an accredited investor in order to meet the federal and state securities law exemptions. Now, there is an exception for that. There's always exceptions for everything. You should try to keep it in the accredited arena. If you can't, you can look to the individual's sophistication level. Like, do they really understand what it means to invest in a startup? At the end of the day, like, they should be able to say, I get that I could lose all of this money. And that's another thing to consider too. A lot of times I get this question of, well, my uncle can do it. It's going to be a stretch for him because he's not accredited, but I really need the money. It's like, do you really need the money from your uncle who probably can't afford it if they aren't an accredited investor? Is this, the savings that they're going to use for their kids' college? You probably don't want to take it. So maybe think about that too when you are dealing with non-accredited folks.
Great advice. Question here around convertible notes. How long does it take to create the convertible note? And are there minimum revenue requirements? And then finally, are there any regulatory SEC filing involved?
So convertible notes can be pretty quick. There's really only 1 to 2 documents. They're fairly short, maybe 5-10 pages each. So that can go quick. maybe, like a week if folks are, there's a little bit of back and forth on them. In terms of revenue requirements, no, you can do a convertible note with nothing. There, it's really just up to the investor to decide, yep, I want to invest in the company. And then the only thing I would note is kind of what related to that last question is every SAFE, every convertible note, every preferred stock, every common stock that you sell has to have a securities exemption. Some securities exemptions do require filings, some don't. That's a whole topic of conversation, but you may have a filing, but it depends on your securities exemption.
Awesome. That's a whole nother webinar that we would love to invite you back to at some point. Let's see, we're getting lots of thank yous in the chat. Question on what are the current conventional or market terms for convertible notes?
Yeah, that's a really good one. So some of the things that you're going to have in a convertible note are going to be like your valuation cap, a discount. Usually you have both. And what that means is the investors get the better of what would result from a valuation cap or a discount. The discount on convertible notes are almost always 20%. I mean, every once in a while you'll see it vary on either side of that, but 20% is right there. On the valuation side of things, that varies a ton. You can take a look at like our entrepreneurs report, some of the other data to see kind of what market you're in and all that good stuff. Maturity date, usually like 12 to 18 months. Interest rate is usually pretty small on these things, 6 to 8%. That's not where investors are looking to make their money. They actually want to convert into equity.
Great, we're running a little light on time. And somebody asked about, let's see, I just wanted to share this with the people still on the call. What are the alternate financing for startups to pass by instead of VC? We're hosting a conversation on that in the coming months. So stay tuned, take a look. We're almost wrapping, but Becki, thank you so much. What's one thing that you want our folks to take away from this conversation?
Well, only one?
Yeah, I mean, you shared a lot, but what's like one thing, like if one was going to walk away and say, here's one thing I want to share that Becki taught me?
Yeah, I mean, I think really just understanding the whole financing process, right? And just knowing like what you're getting into, like the investor dance, as we like to call it, being familiar with it and understanding, okay, this is going to be a process. It's going to kind of take this amount of time. This is the steps that we go through. Obviously, we zoomed through a lot of information today, and there's really detailed stuff at each of those stages, but to have an overview of it, I think is key for founders to understand what they're in store for.
Yeah, and understanding deal terms, which you defined so well in this conversation. So grateful for your sharing your expertise and for all the great things you at Wilson Sonsini are doing. If you haven't already, check out their hub for emerging company practices. They've got a lot of great free resources on there. But Becki, on behalf of everybody on our team and everyone in attendance, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insights with us today.
Absolutely.
For everyone still on the call and my dog joining the room now, we've got some great webinars coming up in the coming week or so, so don't miss out on those. We'll follow up with more information on them. But thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you back online soon. Have a good one, everyone.